This week, we welcome Alla Valente, Principal Analyst at Forrester, to discuss how to regain control over business risk with the 3Es framework. In the Leadership and Communications section, Cybersecurity for Mergers and Acquisitions, a CISO's guide. Your employees aren't the problem, your leadership habits are. When the best leadership skill is just being present, and more. Business Security Weekly starts now.
This is a Security Weekly production for security professionals by security professionals. Please visit securityweekly.com/subscribe to subscribe to all the shows on our network.
It's the show where we explore the business of security to improve the security of business. Your trusted source for actionable insights on leadership, communication, and innovation. Get ready for Business Security Weekly.
Imagine a world where every threat, ransomware, supply chain attacks, zero-day exploits is stopped before it can even begin. ThreatLocker makes that world a reality with a zero-trust approach to cybersecurity. By giving you granular control on every executable that can happen in your environment, ThreatLocker protects your business around the clock. No more guessing, no more gaps. Just rock-solid protection that keeps your operations running smoothly and your data secure. Discover how ThreatLocker's least privilege approach can safeguard your organization against known and unknown threats. Take the first step towards total peace of mind. Visit securityweekly.com/ThreatLocker today.
Welcome to Business Security Weekly. This is episode number 398, recorded June 2nd, 2025. I am your host, Matt Alderman. Joining me for this interview segment are my co-hosts. First, Mr. Ben Carr. How are you, Ben?
Hey Matt, how's it going? Lovely to be on today.
Good long weekend.
Oh yeah, nice long weekend. We've had some crazy weather down here though, like massive hail. Like it's just been insane. Luckily it's missed us, but yeah, it's been good.
Yeah, I live in this weird spot in Texas where stuff either goes north or south of me, so I kind of avoid the crazy hail. So that's good. Also joining me for this interview segment is Mandy Logan. Mandy, welcome to Business Security Weekly.
Thank you. I know this is my first time getting to jump into this ecosphere. Like I'm always on the other side, other than the recorded interviews that we've done together at RSAC or things that maybe have aired here. But yeah, this is really exciting. I'm thankful that you welcomed me.
Yeah, everybody else is kind of off. So this is great. Bring you on and get you exposure to this one. We're going to have a lot of fun with this one. So our guest is Alla Valente. She is the principal analyst at Forrester. Her research interests include governance, risk, and compliance. a little to me as well. Third-party risk management, also one of my sweet spots, and contract lifecycle management. Alla's current research focuses on enterprise risk management, AI risk, and risk management frameworks. Alla helps Forrester's security and risk clients establish strategy, adopt best practices, and select technology. She is also known for her famous meatballs. Alla, welcome to Business Security Weekly. You know, I'm still waiting for those meatballs, by the way.
Matt, great to be here. And yes, I know, I owe you a batch. But hopefully today we can talk about risk management and how it's like meatballs.
Okay, yeah, sure. Everybody wants to know.
I want more info on the meatballs.
So
you've intrigued me. So we can do that later, but like I need to understand the meatball thing. So let's talk risk management.
Well, let's put it this way. Like meatballs, you have to make the best of what you have, right? It's all about the ingredients you're given and how you can utilize them to the best of your ability. Same way with risk, right?
Yes, I agree. So let me give the backstory on this. I saw you at RSA conference. I hadn't seen you in a long time. And I said, look, I bring all your Forrester analyst buddies onto the show. When am I going to get you on? You said, hey, I just did this thing on risk management and the 3Es. I'm like, you're on. Let's go. So I do want to dig into this topic. We can talk meatballs at the end. But one of the big things we've been talking about on this show a lot, right? And all my co-hosts about the risk management aspects of cybersecurity. And, you know, there's so many things going on right now, right? There's certain things you can control, and then there's so many factors outside that you can't control with what's going on right now. And you said, hey, I've got a framework for that. So let's start with kind of the challenges around enterprise risk management right now, because there are so many changing things. What is that kind of doing to the security and CISO audiences right now? Like, what are they experiencing, and what are some of the things they're facing?
Yeah, I mean, let's put it this way. For CISOs, for other C-level executives, it really feels like, you know, everything everywhere all at once, because there's so many factors at play all at the same time. You have all of these new business dynamics, you have financial and economic dynamics, you have trades and policies, not to mention now with speed of innovation, there's new technologies, new tools, great for cybersecurity professionals, great for hackers. Everyone gets a little of something. And so the way we've been approaching, whether it's security or risk management, let's face it, we have the means and the technologies to go far beyond what we've done. And so the way we think about risk, the way we categorize it, the way we approach it, it needs an overhaul, basically.
Oh, we agree with you 100% on that one. It was interesting. I was looking at a report. I can't remember who did it, but something like 84% of the Fortune 500s would receive a D on their cybersecurity compliance, and 43% of them would have Fs, right? Like, something's not currently working, Alla, right?
Yeah, well, so one of the things that's not working is this whole notion that compliance is risk management, right? Because companies can be fully compliant and have just a tremendous amount of risk exposure. Like, think of it this way. Risk management looks to compliance and says, hold my beer. Because it doesn't care, like, risk management doesn't care what regulations you have in place. The forces and the dynamics, both within a company's control and outside of it, are going to dictate what that risk exposure looks like.
Alla,
And I'm curious on that is
I was going to say, it's interesting you say that, because when you think about risk, I think just from my own experience, I'm interested in Mandy and Matthew, if you find the same thing. When you think about how companies perceive risk, they generally perceive it as like a risk to compliance or regulation, right? They don't perceive it as actually how we think about, in a security sense, risk. Like, the risk of regulation or compliance is just one of the risks we face, right? But I think that at its core is really the fine line where we get to try to figure out, like, why is this disconnect there? Do you agree? And why is that the case? Why have we been so poor at communicating?
Absolutely. So look, compliance risk or regulatory risk is a risk domain, but that's not the entirety of the risk picture.
Entirety of it, yeah.
One of the reasons why we are where we are is traditionally risk management in the business sense has been about financial risk, right? Credit risk, exposure. So when you look at companies with chief risk officers, banks, insurance companies, and those chief risk officers, again, are looking at the credit worthiness, investments, that type of financial risk. Then you had in the early 2000s, the Enrons, the WorldComs, the Tycos, where all of a sudden both the regulators and the lawmakers said, holy smokes, there is this other risk that is not financial. And for a while they called it other, and then other became operational. And right around the time when we got Sarbanes-Oxley, and I don't know about you guys, but thanks Sarbanes and Oxley, because that's why a lot of us have jobs today. They said, okay, that's fine. We're going to help you manage this operational, so anything that's not financial. And here's a set of regulations, make sure you're checking the box and doing these things, and that's going to help you manage risk. That was a fundamentally flawed concept, that if you follow regulations, you're managing risk exposure, because perhaps at that point, certain risks are managed through regulations, like corporate malfeasance, unless you're United Health Group right now that's having some issues. For the most part, we haven't seen one of these big Enron-esque scandals. But the types of risks that companies are seeing today, they're so different. And Matt, I know you're a fellow lover of third-party risk. Let's face it, when Sarbanes-Oxley, when the 3 lines of defense was first created, there is no line for third parties because we never saw that level of outsourcing. I mean, I've been in risk management long enough to remember when build versus buy was an actual question. You had to make an actual business case. Today it's easier, it's cheaper, it's, just more streamlined to go purchase. And so now we have these huge ecosystems of third parties, whether they're vendors, service providers, suppliers, whatever you want to call them, that are now sort of in this risk scenario, and risk is a shared responsibility. And so there are some things within the organization that they can control from a risk perspective, but then there's so many forces outside of their control. And I think that companies as a whole, whether they're CISOs or other executives, they're still trying to use frameworks that, are traditionally worked to manage the environment that is so completely different than it ever was. And that's where the disconnect lies.
I know Mandy's got a question.
Yeah. Oh,
yeah.
yes.
I know Mandy's
Go
got
ahead.
a question. Go ahead.
I have several for sure, but on this, speaking about compliance and using what is becoming somewhat outdated frameworks, going back to your report on the 3 E's, when talking about risk velocity, especially in face of AI adoption, the way that technology is advancing so quickly and the frameworks are outdated, what is your take on that? And what are you seeing as far as risk velocity just actually impacting the environment? And then separately, I wanted to really bring out something that I valued from the report relating to all of this, because you highlighted how there were 403 climate-related events in 2024 that had a massive financial impact. But a lot of times, in my view, like compliance, how often does it really account for
It
climate
doesn't. I mean,
events?
unless you're talking about climate regulations, and we know that in the US, we don't really have those. So we're not factoring for those types of externalities. But to your point about risk velocity, so look, velocity is that speed between the time when a risk event happens and how quickly it's felt inside of an organization. And today that's nearly instantaneous. And that's for a number of reasons. One is that you have digitalization of everything, right? The entire business, every business process runs on some sort of technology. So we need to understand technology disruption versus technology resilience. At the same time, we also have globalization. So every business system is so interconnected and interdependent that, it's like this butterfly effect for business, right? Like butterfly flaps its wings here and all of a sudden, your podcast just lost connectivity. And so these are new dynamics that are taking the speed of that pain and increasing it exponentially. And if we're focused on meeting requirements, or in other words, designing our controls, fine-tuning our security controls to meet these regulatory requirements, what we're missing is that regulators are not proactive in how they design regulatory requirements, which means that the risk has already been realized. You're basically trying to control that something that's already happened, not necessarily trying to foresee what the next risk event is going to be. And that's one of the reasons why compliance is your floor. It's your absolute minimum. It just says these are the minimum standards that you need to have to be able to operate. But when innovation is moving quickly, when cybersecurity and threats and vulnerabilities are working so quickly, when you have AI kind of, sprinkling like dynamite everywhere, those regulatory requirements that are just the minimum are not even close to being enough. And that's why we're seeing that companies that are absolutely compliant, the auditors came in, you got the clean bill of health, my SOC 2 is wonderful, everything is great. And then they're experiencing disruption, they're experiencing breaches, cyber attacks, because again, those requirements are not going to prevent the type of risks that we're seeing today, but also it doesn't give you that lag time, that buffer to take action because that pain is so quickly felt.
So I want to take this to the board level for a second.
Okay.
Because where I think some of this disconnect is at the board level. I don't know that the board understands or cares about some of these risks, which creates a challenge for us, I think, right? Like,
I think cares is the operable part, Matt. Cares is really important.
Yeah. So let me finish this thought out for a second, Alana, because I want your feedback is, you're right. We haven't seen an Enron type of financial event, but we have seen cyber events like Change Healthcare that had major dollar impacts to the environment. But yet I haven't seen enough adoption of addressing cyber and some of these other risks at the board level. And until we do we ever solve for the holistic business risk problem? Like, that's just, if the board doesn't care, like, what are we all doing? We're just running around, preaching to ourselves half the time.
I mean, that's an excellent question. I'm going to start by saying it's not that boards don't care. It's that they don't understand enough to care, right? So look, board members are not cybersecurity professionals. They're not risk management professionals. I mean, yes, you now need board members that know how to read a financial statement, right? That's why we have audit committees, but risk committees are still not mandated. Cybersecurity committees are still not mandated. That type of expertise in getting a board with at least a few members that can understand that cyber risk is business risk. Once they can kind of create that picture of how cybersecurity powers the organization and how any threat to cybersecurity will translate in business disruption to customers, financial losses. And I'm not even talking about the fees and the penalties for being non-compliant. I'm talking actual financial losses. And
Right.
Here's one more dynamic that we're seeing in play. And I do think that this is sort of churning the heads of board members, which is that we are seeing that in this vacuum of regulations, right? In the absence of some comprehensive federal regulations around cybersecurity, not just pockets, not just certain industries, but not others, we're seeing a rise in litigation. I mean, how many class action lawsuits, after a breach, after a privacy violation, now all of a sudden it's like, oh, wow, compliance fines, those are peanuts. Last year, when we did the predictions for 2025, one of the things that we predicted was that the cost of fighting or defending these class action lawsuits was going to be 2x of what regulatory penalties are. I actually think that number is low. I think it's shaking out to be closer to 3x or 4x, because these class action lawsuits, they're expensive if you want to defend. And even if the company wins, nobody wins really, because, there's a cost in just like attorney fees and motions and things like that. And that's why we're seeing companies settle. And they're settling for astronomical amounts because they want this pain to go away. And that is absolutely catching the attention of boards.
The lawyers win at the end of the day.
The lawyers
That's
always
who
win.
wins,
Yeah.
right? That's who's winning.
Pretty
in
much,
those
yes.
battles. Yeah.
So I want to follow the thread where you said that, because I said caring is really the important part, and you said it's not that board members don't care. But kind of everything you said there, like, to me, indicates that there is a lack of caring. And I attribute that, or I correlate that to look, every business is a digital business, whether you realize it or not, right? We've
Absolutely.
talked about this on the show before. You make toilet paper, you're still a digital business. Yet board members don't seem to be concerned or care about the fact that they're all digital, and the lack of participation on the board of people who have expertise on the digital side, either from an IT or security side. It's kind of rampant, right? We don't see a lot of companies that really have representation there. And in fact, to my knowledge, the NACD seems, which is the body that represents board members, seems to push back on this idea that you need representation of security or technology on the board to actually be effective as a board. How do you feel about that, given the care statement, right? Like that would seem just directly in opposition to the fact that they care and they're stuck, and the only thing that's going to move this is regulation saying you have to have like a SOX for technology and risk, right? Like you can't just be financial. You have to think about also the technological and the security issues that you have as well.
Yeah. Okay. So I want to answer that in kind of two ways. One is I do think we're going to need an actual law that says that boards have to be diversified with the different types of knowledge. In fact, when I guess it was a few years ago now, when the SEC had updated their cyber risk governance regulation, one of the things that they had in the proposed rule was that companies had to disclose what the cybersecurity knowledge base was of their boards. That got wiped out when the final rule. Exactly. But it is going to take something like that. Ideally, it's going to happen sooner rather than later. So with that type of regulation, you're going to see better board diversity. But once you have someone with that type of knowledge and expertise on the board, you don't need every single member that has that expertise, but somebody who can translate the cyber speak to board speak, because boards have a fiduciary responsibility that's mostly financial, right? Duty of care. They're not tasked with helping to shape the cybersecurity strategy. But having them understand the importance of cybersecurity, especially as it relates to business, not just business compliance, but really business performance, because cybersecurity isn't just your value protection, it's your value creation. And once you can weave that narrative in a way that boards can understand, I do absolutely think they are going to care, because now they're going to have that light bulb aha moment to say, oh, wait a minute, this is business risk. And, I know the report we're talking about talks about enterprise risk, but I just want to clarify the difference between sort of enterprise risk, this traditional ERM COSO framework, versus risk in the enterprise, right? Like anything that impacts the enterprise from that business perspective. So we are thinking about it much more broadly. This is risk to the business.
Yeah, and I think what we need is the SOX regulation for security, right? We almost need something similar to that codifies these cyber risks in a similar sense to how we've been looking at the financial risks associated with Sarbanes-Oxley, right? Like I've said it before, I was hoping that the SEC guidelines were going to go down that path. They didn't, and without that, we're still in this kind of standstill. Yeah. Let's get into some of the recommendations in the report, right? You talk about the 3 E's framework. What are the 3 E's, and how can clients start to use the concept of these 3 E's to start to get their arms around this?
Yeah, I mean, okay, so this is the land of volatility, and I don't know about you guys, but I don't see this going away anytime soon. If it's not one thing, it's something else, and it's just coming at you all at once. Taking a step back, organizations, CISOs need to understand, what do they have control over and to what extent? And I developed this 3 E's, which stands for enterprise, ecosystem, and externalities, to say, okay, look, I have risks from three primary sources. One are the risks in my enterprise from my enterprise. So basically, this is the stuff that I created. This is my business strategy. These are my investments. These are my policies. These are my assets, whatever it is. Now, if you find that there's a specific risk that's impeding your business strategy, you can fix it. I'm not saying it's going to be quick or easy or all of that, but if you need to invest in new tools, you could do that. If you need to ramp up headcount, you could do that because you have full control. The second E is that ecosystem, right? All of these partners. And by the way, we're not just talking about software vendors or services providers. I mean, now look at, open source, or let's look at AI. Let's look at so many outsourced processes. Let's look at that contingent workforce, right? Call centers, you're outsourcing all sorts of things. The key here to understand is that without that ecosystem, you don't have a business. And we found this out the hard way during COVID when all of our ecosystems started, they were under strain and started buckling. We realized, oh, wow, no, we need a resilient ecosystem. That's kind of important. So whatever they do, whatever risks they face, impact you directly. But the challenge is you don't have full control. You can't make your third party do anything. And we know because we've tried. I mean, just getting them to respond to one of those assessment questionnaires is like pulling teeth. Here's the key, though. It's not that you have zero control. It's that the control that you have is right before you contract. That's when they're willing to give you information. That's when they're willing to disclose. That's when you can start to, if you did some sort of, risk assessment of not just the entity, but if relevant of the product or whatnot, you could say, hey, I think I'm taking on a bit more risk exposure than I had planned on, than, what's within my tolerance and my appetite. So what you can do, there are a couple of things. You can start to add language and clauses into contracts that are going to protect you later on. You can start to use that contract to define responsibility and timeframes for when you have disruptions and outages and breaches. Or you can say, this cost that we negotiated, it's not working for me, and maybe we need to readjust that based on level of risk. And then you have this third thing, this ecosystem, and Forrester, we call these things systemic risks because these are forces outside of any company's control. So, Mandy, to your point, climate risks, can't really control that. Economic uncertainty, geopolitical tensions, trade wars, but also things like changing customer expectations, speed of innovation. Again, all of these forces, you can't stop them from happening, but here's what you can do. You can say contextually, based on what my company does, where we operate, who our customers are, what our products are, what are those external forces that would be most problematic? So, if you're in retail, you might say this tariff thing is like really critical. If you're in infrastructure, you might say, "Oh, this climate thing is like super important." If you're in tech, you're saying speed of innovation, we have to get a handle on it. And so at least by categorizing your risks into those three E's, what you can say is, where can I affect the most change, right? What can I accept? What do I need to remediate? What might I be able to transfer? But where do I want to put my time, my resources, and my attention? And it's really, sometimes that calculation changes, monthly, weekly. It might require a little bit of shifting, but at least you can regain some of that control so you're not blindsided by everything.
Yeah, I think, the first two E's of this, we've been pretty bad at, right? Like getting our own enterprise risk under control and our ecosystem, right? I mean, I still see this, Alla. I don't know if you still see it on your side, but we still have not solved third-party risk management in any meaningful way.
I mean, I could talk for hours about this, and this might require a different podcast, but here's the challenge with third-party risk. And, our data shows this. it's important. It's just not as important as other risk areas. And the other risk areas are much more compliance driven. It's also third party risk is not something you could quickly cross off your to-do list. It's kind of a longer term game because you can take these different actions, but you might not see the results of it that quickly. And so what do companies want to invest in? The things that are, those quick dopamine hits. Oh, I did this thing and, here's the low hanging fruit. So it's not that it's not important because I can tell you that security and risk professionals, they care about third party risk. They want to do better. It's just not necessarily the organization's top priority. And that's really sad considering how critical third party risk is when it comes to cyber exposure, risk exposure, financial exposure.
Right. And we have control over both of those areas, or more control over both of those areas than the externalities
Absolutely.
where we have no control,
Yep.
right? And so if we struggle in areas that we have control, how do we ever get our arms around the ones that we don't have any control over?
I mean, I think it's also understanding that your ecosystem, they're also companies just like you. They have their own enterprise risks, but they're also impacted by those externalities. So, for example, if you have third parties in a given geography, and you're looking at, maybe you're sensitive to geopolitical fluctuations or impact of climate risk or even just changing regulations in that region, you actually have control to say, you know what, maybe we're going to go from this third party to this other one that might not be as sensitive to that externality. But
Yeah.
that's something that's better than sitting there waiting for the event to happen only to say, "Ooh, we didn't see that coming."
Right. Yeah. I mean, and look, there's examples of this. I mean, we can look at Apple's decisions to move some of its manufacturing out of China into India in prep for potential tariffs, right? But it's still a big impact to them as a business, as an externality that they don't have a lot of control over because you can't switch manufacturing that quickly in another country, right? But if you're thinking ahead,
Sure.
you can at least start to put strategies in place to maybe minimize that impact. And I assume that's what you're talking about.
Yes, that's absolutely one. But here's another example, right? So, I think it was a couple of weeks ago, we saw the story about Coinbase, insider risk. But some of those insiders were actually, outsourced contractors. Now, if we're looking at this three E's holistically, right? What's the impact to my company? You would say, wow, there's all of this economic uncertainty right now. Perhaps employees, whether they are employees of the company or contractors, might be highly sensitive to economic pressures, might be motivated by economic rewards. Maybe this means we need to put in a few extra controls. And so by looking at that externality and taking action that impacts the ecosystem, you are now minimizing your own enterprise risk. And truly, that's how connected all of this is.
Yeah, it still goes back to some level of mitigating or compensating control to mitigate the potential risk, whether it's external base or it's externalities, whether it's ecosystem or whether it's your own enterprise. And it's just trying to figure out how best to prioritize
It
those.
is. And I love that you mentioned prioritization because looking at it from the lens of those three E's, you're able to prioritize. You can do that calculation to say, where might the greatest disruption be if I did nothing? Because you can't mitigate every risk.
Right.
You have to be much more targeted and much more focused. But at the same time, this isn't just about fixing whatever we can. We need to fix the things that are going to help support our business strategy. So if this particular risk is not going to impact a strategic priority, and I don't mean in the short term, I mean if this event materializes, will it have that type of broader impact on our business? We need to think about deploying our resources so that we're, supporting that business strategy. And I think that is really the key of how we get cybersecurity and business aligned, because the business needs help. They don't know what they're doing when it comes to cyber risk. But at the same time, risk needs to understand what the business is trying to do. And when everyone's on the same page, it's a much easier lift.
I'm curious, like, how much thought do you feel should go into thinking about overlapping critical risk events? And partly I say that because in the report, it talked about 20% of the ERM decision makers reported that they were having a critical risk event every other month.
Yeah. So there are a couple of things. There are risks that trigger other risks. For example, especially with those external forces. If you remember back to the pandemic, you had this pandemic, but then it also impacted supply chains with that, which then also impacted cybersecurity, which then also impacted these other things. But then there is this notion of discrete critical risk events. And depending on which area of the business the risk event is first identified, they are only looking at it from their lens. So, for example, if it's the business continuity team, they might only be looking at it from that business continuity lens. If it's in operational risk, they might only be looking at operations. What we need to start doing is looking at risk events to say, what is the impact from this event on all of the different areas of our business? Because then we can start to realize that maybe perhaps one mitigation strategy might curtail the impact in one area, but it still has this long tail that it can continue to disrupt the organization. And like the other thing we're realizing is that all of these risks that go into that risk register, right? Oftentimes it's the same risk. It's just, again, this is the long tail of it. And we're now seeing sort of that cascading impact.
Do you think we ever get to a consolidated risk officer or risk discipline? Because that's the only, like, how else would I mean, you can try to coordinate it, but doesn't somebody have to own all these risks holistically? Because otherwise, I don't know how that you ever solve some of these overlapping, cascading kind of risk issues, do we?
I mean, look, that's a great point. And I would argue to say, well, we do have sort of someone that owns risk. It's just not always the same person for different organizations. And they're not always in a level of authority or power to necessarily do something about it. So we are seeing more companies now have chief risk officers, and companies that are not just in financial services, but outside of them. We're also seeing that those risk officers, more of them are reporting to the CEO, not finance. Because if you remember, traditionally, risk management, or at least GRC, fell under finance because they saw it as, this is the cost of compliance. This is the cost of doing business. So therefore, it's a cost center. I don't think that every company, I mean, because of their scale, their scope, how they're structured, can have the same exact structure for risk management. But I think the key is to make sure that you have a centralized risk management functions that doesn't just look at one risk area, but broadly aggregates risk across the enterprise. And also that they are in a position where they can bring those risks to the attention of whether it's the CEO and or the board, because we are also seeing chief risk officers having that dotted line to the board so that something could be done about it. It could become, more of a strategic priority, get the type of attention. In other words, get the budget that it needs. But as long as we have these functional risk managers inside of different business areas that don't necessarily share, aggregate their data, collaborate, you're going to see, pockets of goodness, but it's not going to move the needle.
Yeah, and if we want to get the board to pay attention to care, somehow we got to get this stuff to the board level, right? So
And you have to,
maybe that's the only way we
and
do
you have
it.
to put it in dollars and cents, right? They understand finance,
Yeah.
so
They
cyber
do.
is quantification, right? That's one of the main use cases for it. Getting the board to care.
Exactly right. Yeah, right. Because we can quantify it into dollars. They understand dollars. They can understand the potential impact. Anyways,
Yeah.
yes, big believer in that, but we're still struggling there. Just trust me, I see it every
Well, look,
day.
we're not going to see all of this improve overnight, but I do think that regaining some control, having a much more focused approach to where you target your risk management efforts helps you from burning out, but also helps you kind of take on those right risks and protect those critical business strategies.
Now, in one of your blog posts, in which you made an awesome example about a roller coaster, which I did want to reference, not just the meatballs, but we need to talk about Big Mama.
Oh,
And
never again.
yeah, her point was that was her one and only roller coaster situation, but you explain it. Like, why did you use that example?
Because sometimes we're in a position where we don't have control over what's happening to us. And part of the terror of it is that we can't say enough, like, let's get off, let's stop, let's do something different, because that power has been taken away from us. So this blog post was, my teenage years, I succumbed to peer pressure, I went on a roller coaster, I'm afraid of heights, I'm claustrophobic, like there's no reason I should have been on it. But that's what being a CISO feels like today. That's what being, a chief risk officer feels like today, where so much of this seems like it's outside of your control, and it's someone else that's controlling the speed and the velocity. That one of the reasons I wrote this report about the 3 E's is to say, okay, maybe you can get off. Maybe you can say, this is the approach I want to take. Like, you don't necessarily need to get so wrapped up in that whole terror situation that you feel like you're helpless. You feel like, and that's one of the biggest challenges when you have this type of volatility, because when business leaders can't trust their own judgment, they stop making decisions. It leads to this paralysis. And that's not the best approach to run a business. Like, you need to have confidence in the decisions you're making.
Yeah.
And then
ahead,
from the
Mandy.
same blog post, you mentioned, thank you, you extended the offer for Forrester clients that they could reach out to you for a guidance session. What does that look like?
So for our Forrester clients, a guided session is a 15-minute call where, we review their strategic priorities, offer advice, go through research, but also it's more of like this conversation of, practical solutions, sharing of best practices, and both the enterprise risk as well as the third-party risk are the 2 most common guided session calls that I'm getting these days, because it's really difficult to wrap your arms around the level of risk management that you have to do just to be able to survive today.
Yeah, I see that every day. Alla, it was a pleasure. Thank you so much for joining us on Business Security Weekly.
It was my pleasure. Thank you, everyone. And let's talk about meatballs next time.
You got it. All right, so let's get into this week's articles, but first, let me welcome 2 of my co-hosts that joined us for this segment. First, Mr. Jason Albuquerque. Welcome, Jason.
Hey there, Matt. How are you? Not much going on in the NFL. Just typical news, some practices going on, but NBA finals are coming up, so Pacers OKC. Here we go.
Here we go. Also joining for this article segment is Summer Fowler. Welcome, Summer.
Hello. So not quite a professional sport, but my son played for Team USA for the World Cup in ball hockey this weekend, and they beat Team Canada 3-0 to win the gold.
Nice.
So very exciting. U15 group. Yeah, it was pretty awesome.
That's awesome. You got all these athletes. The 2 of you, You guys are killing it, killing it. I only ended up with one kind of athlete. I mean, I don't know. I guess you guys are better than I am at it as a father. All right, let's get into this week's articles. Obviously, I'm going to start off with some fireworks, Jason, as I always do. These first two articles, how is the role of the CISO evolving? Is it evolving? Is it really, really pivotal figure in organizational strategy and security posture? Like, I'm just saying.
So at the end of the day, I appreciated the dichotomy between the first and the second article. One paints the rosy nirvana picture of what the CISO quote unquote is within an organization, and we all know there's a lot of struggles that go on in the CISO role. And the second, is a little bit more of a reality check. But yeah, I went through this article and said, man, if only. Wow, if only it were like this everywhere, and so some of the stats that they put out there, you have a little issue with, because I don't know, what were we at last time we checked the stats? 49% of organizations don't have a CISO. It was up close to 50.
I think it's close to 50% of the Fortune 500 don't have a named CISO.
Yeah, right. Yeah. Exactly. So this was the first article was a rosy picture of what we aspire life as a CISO to be within an organization. Say that much.
Well, I also think it matters like what you're looking at as far as the statistics and like how you explain them, right? Like the devil's in the details on that. So 82% of CISOs interact directly with the CEO. Well, I'm just going to say interacting does not mean that you say hi in the elevator or the hallway on the way to your office or the dungeon where you got stuck. 83% attended board meetings on a regular basis. Again, regular means at least quarterly. It does not mean like you got asked to come in for 15 minutes because the CIO couldn't answer questions that he needed your backup. So I think, again, devil's in the details. What do the statistics mean? What are you actually saying? You can make it come out rosy, but this isn't reality, I don't think. At least not.
And I'd love to get your guys' opinions on one of the stats I pulled out in my notes. It's the good old stat about the talent crunch, and I looked at it, and they're still quoting, ISC Squared's 4.76 million professionals is making it so hard for CISOs because there's a talent crunch. And then I went and I did a little research, because we've been talking about this a lot on the show. There were 1,115 RIFs last year that impacted 238,461 technology professionals in 2024. I'm sure some of those were cybersecurity professionals as well. So, I mean, what's your take on that? Because we're still throwing around this close to 5 million professional number, and I'm just not seeing it.
I think it goes to the rosiness and the nirvana of what we think the market should be.
Yeah, exactly.
Well,
in reality, I don't think we're there.
What does the stat mean? What does the stat mean, right? Like if in order to do the job properly and secure organizations as needed, you needed 4.76 million professionals, maybe, but we're not doing that. And we're not hiring for that.
Right.
That requirement.
Yeah, we don't have the budget for that.
Requirement.
Exactly.
Yeah.
As the next
the
article
budget
will tell
issue,
us,
right? And like the trade-off of like what an org wants to do for risk and security, and that's not this.
Yeah.
There was one sentence in there that I pulled out that I said, all right, this has some value. The CISO of today and tomorrow must be adaptable, business savvy, and technologically astute. That's a great sentence.
Great sentence. I have pretty much all leaders in some form or fashion.
True.
Okay.
The other thing I thought that this article was missing in its rose-colored glasses was the liability aspect of this, and thinking about what recent CISOs have really had to face in terms of personal liability, let alone the professional liability that they have. So again, more towards the, hey, this was such a really nice picture of what it means to have this title.
Yeah. So we get into the second article, which is more the reality check. There's still some rosy glasses.
It starts
on this
that
one
way.
too.
It starts rosy, right? It starts with, hey, compensation is up, and $532,000 a year, for organizations that have $1 billion or more in revenue. But then it actually starts getting into the reality where responsibilities are increasing, right? They're doing CISOs are doing reasonably well in the marketplace, but there's still constraints, there's still restrictions, there's still a lot going on, especially with budget, like Summer mentioned, right? Budget is a big constraint these days, and budgets are going down. There was a stat in here that budgets are actually going down.
Yeah. Like point. Yeah.
So something that I would add to this, though. Yeah, something I would add to this as we talk through this, though, is, again, sometimes these articles are in our little echo chamber. I did some research into this to see how do cybersecurity budgets compare to other department budgets. Mm-hmm. And frankly, if it's to be believed, and I was looking at large organizations only, so I didn't really look at small to medium business, but on average, the cybersecurity budget has increased 49% from 2021 to 2025. Now that's showing the upswing. And the next closest was procurement budgets, and they had only gone up 23%. So if you look across a ton of different departments, cybersecurity actually went up way more than other departments. So think how they feel.
I also compare that, though, to cybersecurity budgets were virtually nothing because they were judged as part of the IT budget, right? When you look at an IT budget, that averages somewhere between 5% to 6.9, 7% of a typical budget, right? So number one, we were starting underground. So getting a significant, I don't think we're where we need to be, I guess is my point.
Or Jason, even if it's not part of IT, like there are a lot of organizations that started off literally from zero, right? Like I joined Norg at one point in my career, right? Hired as the CISO, and they had no people, no process, and no technology, like nothing.
Right.
Nothing. And so it was building up from scratch. And so, when you come from zero, it's really easy to get to a 49% hockey stick improvement in growth.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, compared to other departments, I don't think we're even in the zone of where we need to be from a budget perspective.
Well, it talked about percentage.
That is a completely fair point.
Yeah, it looked at it from a percent of revenue perspective, and it's declining, where IT budgets and other budgets probably are not declining at that same ratio, which is what I think his point was in the article. Yeah. Yep. There are some interesting guides here in this week's. The first one is Cybersecurity for Mergers and Acquisition, a CISO's guide from CISO Advisory. Any thoughts on this one?
I mean, I love this article. This is something that, at least I've evangelized for probably close to a decade at this point. Why is cybersecurity not embedded in every M&A due diligence process? Should be. We've talked about it for 6 years on this show, and it's just something I've evangelized all the way to sitting down with companies who perform M&A for a living. That's what they do. Why don't you have cyber diligence up front? And just challenging it. It's trying to get some of these organizations out of the muscle memory of how they've always done it, and just thinking out of the box. I went through an exercise at one point in my career, and honestly helped save over $1 million for an acquisition, right? Because they found technical debt, they found integration problems. They just did a full blown audit and came back, and they were able to save over $1 million in the acquisition.
This is a great area to be a business partner, right? Like to actually contribute to the business and not be a cost center, but add to the bottom line, because I frequently find that same thing, Jason. Like you go in and you look at it, and there's a lot of due diligence issues around cyber, and it can really affect what the acquisition price could be, right? In material.
Absolutely.
It can be a material differentiator. And so if you're not involving them super early, I mean, my typical experience is, hey, we just signed the papers on this acquisition and we're good to go. Can you go in and take a look real quick? It's like,
after the fact,
like
absolutely.
We're too late. Like you're past anything I can offer and do, right?
That's right.
Yeah.
Well, remember
and we saw this 12 years ago when Verizon was acquiring Yahoo, right? I mean, this was 12 years ago.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. And even some of the stuff from T-Mobile, et cetera, is part of some of that work. And it does talk at the bottom, towards the bottom of this article, cybersecurity as a value driver. Look, that's what we've been trying to do with this role for a long time, right? Because it's viewed as such a cost center. Can it provide value? Absolutely it can. If you engage early in the process, you can actually get some value out of your security folks to let them take a look at these potential acquisition targets before you bring them in, and then realize all the tech debt, all the missing controls and all the money you're going to have to spend, which only puts you back in that old mentality of it's just cost center, you're just asking for more money.
That's it.
Yeah,
That's
well,
it. Yeah,
look,
I mean, go ahead, Ben.
Go ahead, Jason.
I was just going to say, I think one of the things I want to call out is that they had a stat in here of 83% of boards are now mandating pre-deal cybersecurity assessments. I'm not buying that. I don't know where that stat came from, but what I'm seeing, I'm going to call BS on that all day long. I don't know about you guys, but I'm not seeing it.
Yeah, they talked to 10 boards and 8.3% of those boards.
There you go.
Right? Like, it was a small sample size. Look, at the end of the day, I would posit, my theory on this is they don't involve us on purpose, because most times it's just like, wanting to push product out the door in the dev cycle. They don't want to find out at the last minute they have something, but their theory is it's better just to hold it close to the vest and not find out, and then it'd be too late to do anything about. And I think that's the same thing on the investment side, right? On the acquisitions. They look at it and they go, we've already decided we want to go in this direction. Don't involve security because we know it's bad across the industry. We're going to find something and it's going to cause a problem, so don't highlight it. I think that's the theory. I don't know if anyone would admit it.
I know. Yeah, I get that, Ben, and you're probably dead on right. But at the end of the day, I think it's up to us to evangelize the fact that, it's the old adage, you can't claim ignorance anymore, right? I mean, at the end of the day, you're a board, you're an acquiring organization, cybersecurity is important. It's all over the news everywhere now. Mm-hmm. You can't claim ignorance anymore. You just can't. You can't.
And if we're going to try to pretend that we can.
Shareholder lawsuits. Go ahead, Summer.
Yeah, and beyond that, if that is the tactic that's going to be taken, then you have to reserve that budget and that staff to take care of it when you do make the acquisition. Mm-hmm. And we don't see that happening either.
No, you don't. And that ties into this next article on this handy list of risk questions every healthcare CISO should ask potential vendors. No. It doesn't matter whether you're in healthcare or not. These are the questions that should be asked, right? Because we have some of the same challenges here when it comes to the third party side of this, right? If you think the decision's already in on an M&A, think about how many decisions are already made from a vendor procurement perspective before some of these reviews are done, right? And I've seen this emerging as an area that we still have not solved 20 years after. It's been longer than that, but I remember 20 years ago doing this work, right? We're still nowhere in a better position with a lot of our third-party vendors. So I thought this was a really interesting article because, it's coming from the healthcare angle, but I'm like, look, every industry could use this.
Yeah, I think, slight tweak I would recommend on this. Here are some of the questions you should ask. Right. Not here are the 3 questions to ask.
Yeah.
There's a lot missing here. We could spend an entire show talking about what's missing here. I think this should be teed up as here are some questions that should be asked.
Yeah. Well, the standard information gathering
question categories.
Right. There you go.
Well, because the standard information gathering form is what, 1,400 plus questions? Right. So there's lots of questions to potentially ask your vendors. I think what he's getting to in this particular article is focus on some of these like initial ones, right? Because one of the things I used to have to do was understand kind of what types of data they had access to, the sensitivity of the data, was it internet facing, right? And some of those questions are important because they potentially expose a bunch of other security controls that you want to do. This is I think to help you start to scope getting your arms around this. But yeah, you're right, Jason. This is by no means the complete list.
Yeah, this is only the seed. Let that, sow the seed, let it grow, because there's a lot more.
Oh yeah. I agree. There's a section in here that's really interesting. This is on the full audit report, right? Okay, I get it. Back in the day when I used to do this, I remember I'd send a questionnaire to the vendor and they would give me a SAS 70. Now I just dated myself because we don't use SAS 70s anymore. We use SOC 2s. And I'm like, yeah, but remember what a SOC 2 is, people, right? It's the company's set of controls that they attested to. It may not be the entire set of controls that you're looking for to get attested to. So one of the gaps I see in third-party vendor risk reviews is that, okay, I have a SOC 2, but is it inclusive of all the things I want to know about? In most cases,
what's the scope?
Right.
All about the scope.
It's no. There's more, right? And so just getting access to the SOC 2 Type 2 isn't necessarily enough to address these concerns either.
Yeah. Right. Yeah, I mean, to be honest with you, looking at a SOC 2 Type 2, it's looking at what trust service criteria they actually tested you on as well, because there's 5. You don't have to test all 5.
Right.
You could just do the basic security and that's it, right?
Yeah. Yeah. That's why those reports by
The
themselves.
thing I was shocked about not having written in here from a healthcare standpoint was asking the question about fourth party. So asking your third party about their management, because we've seen a lot of fourth and fifth party breaches that lead to really bad things. And I was a little surprised not to see that listed. I mean among the 100 other things.
Yeah, I mean, like you said, Summer, that's an entire domain that they should have put in here, right? Domain of questions.
But what would you expect to get back, really? Like, when fourth party, it's like, it's so poorly done on the third party. Like, fourth party, like, it hasn't, blank stares, right? Like,
it isn't, but it's third party to that company.
Right, right.
Yeah.
Yes,
you're right. You're right.
Yeah, like it just becomes this long tail of like, how do you track that down and figure that out, right? Like they ask, how fast can your provider recover from an incident? I wager that the answer you're going to get back isn't accurate. Like it's just they probably don't really know, right? Like what's the basis of their answer? That's more important to understand is how did you come up with that?
Right.
Yeah.
Well, especially if you have dependencies on other parties to get your service back up and running, right? Which is kind of to the point with the fourth parties is where is your concentration risk? Let's say you have a ton of third parties that all use the same third party provider to them, and that now becomes your weak point, right? This is one of those conversations we had with the cloud providers, right? Like if everybody's using AWS and AWS goes down, then all my third parties are hosed, which means I'm hosed. And so until you can get to the downstream potential data, it's hard to really understand as a business, where are your concentrated risk areas? Because the cloud provider could be one, because you're using it and all your third parties are using it. Any disruption to that environment could really put you in a world of hurt.
And I think people over-index necessarily on smaller providers, which there's a lot of risk there because they just don't have the programs to support it. But you look at something like Change, like I'm sure a lot of people don't go, oh man, like let's do a deep dive into Change. Like we have to assume that they're a very large org, so they're doing it right? Amazon, like how many people rely on Amazon or Microsoft or GCP? And if there's an outage there, it's hugely impactful, but like you don't have any way to actually get the answers you potentially want. You're just going to get the boilerplate that they send out, and you've got no index for change. You can't force them to do anything because of the scale.
Right. You're just gonna get what's in the contract that you sign. That's it.
Yep.
You're not gonna get in reality. You're gonna get what they promote. Plain and simple. CrowdStrike, hello, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I've got an interesting story, a little bit on that one. I remember someone reached out to me about their contract. She was on the legal side looking into the contract, and she's like, the terms in here are just crazy. Is this like standard? And I'm like, yeah, that's what they try to do. She goes, we'll never sign this. But you've got to look at the contracts, right? So,
yeah, right.
Yeah,
exactly.
That's exactly right. Which means they didn't get affected when that outage happened because they didn't buy it. Anyways. All right. So next up, your employees aren't the problem. Your leadership habits are.
Yeah. You know, I really like this article because right out of the gate, it hits what most managers / leaders will do, knee-jerk reaction. When a team underperforms, most leaders look outward. They start looking at where teams may not be performing well or individuals may not be performing well. They never take a step back and think about how they've affected the culture. or what they've done to maybe promote the underperformance. And I think that's the first step as a leader, as a mature leader. The first thing you do is say, did I do enough to enable this team and get them to where they need to be? That should be the first question.
Jason, it's such a great point. I have an example from my team today. Not airing any inside baseball, but we were talking about our first half goals. And, we had our say easy, do hard about OKRs. We're sticklers. We have objectives. We have key results. And we got to this midpoint of the year almost and looked, and we really did not achieve what we wanted to. And the leads who report to me and I sat down and said, all right, let's talk about why this is. Mm-hmm. And it literally was us. It was, one, we overprescribed the amount of work. Our eyes were bigger than our stomach. Yep. Two, we didn't do enough to account for those things that would come in and make our other work overcome by events, right? So the yep. unplanned activities. And three, we didn't drive accountability in the appropriate way. And so we've made those adjustments moving forward. And frankly, when we had our all hands, we just laid it out and said, this is on us. And here's why. I loved this article. I thought it was spot on, because you have to do that. And if you're not willing to make the changes within your leadership, you're not going to see those advances in your team.
And kudos to you, Summer, and your team, because so many leaders don't do that, right? So many leaders will start pointing fingers out of the gate. And how powerful is it for your team to sit back and listen and watch the leadership of their department be accountable for that? And not only say, we realize, we see it, but here's what we're going to do to make it better for you as employees. That's ultimate employee retention right there.
Right.
That's trust. That's trust building at its finest.
From your lips to the engineering god's ears, Jason.
Yep.
I want to keep my team.
Right. But Summer, to the exercise you did, not a lot of leaders do that. Mm-hmm. And they don't spend the time to figure it out and kind of own up to that. And if you don't, why do you think your good performers leave? Because they see that it's just hypocrisy, right? It's like, yeah, okay, you guys are the problem, but you can't recognize you're the problem. That's why you get really good resources leaving, because they can see it, you can't see it. And so guess what? If you're not going to own up to it, you're not going to address it, why am I here? And that's when you're going to see that mass exodus. And I think it's important for leaders to understand this and look in the mirror and go, yeah, it's on me. And put your hand up and let the team know, and then talk through how you fix it, right? But without that ownership, I think it's really hard for the downstream employees to...
And it's what breeds trust.
Yeah.
Trust is the foundation of every strong relationship. And if the team doesn't trust its leadership, you're not going to get a high-performing team. We know it. This isn't like some hidden secret. High-trust environments have better performers, plain and simple. Better teams, better performance.
Yep, absolutely. All right, last article for this week, when the best leadership skill is just being present. I had not heard this term before, called attunement. And the first thing I thought of, Jason, was empathetic leadership, right? Empathy, but it's a little more than that.
Yeah. It's funny. This goes outside of just work, right? I mean, I struggle, and this is, just being vulnerable as a leader. This is a place that I struggle with my wife. I truly do, right? It's like, all right, shut up and stop trying to solve a problem and just listen. Because I'm such a problem solver. And technologists usually are. We love to solve problems. We love to fix things. And sometimes my wife will look at me, she'll be like, I don't need a fix. Let's just talk.
Right.
Right? I'm like, okay, get out of problem solving mode. Right? And that's the whole point of this. The whole point of this. And I would say, if anything, everybody read the story that is in the front of the article. The front of the article is a story about an employee who walks into an office, talks about how they're struggling, talks about how they need clarification and they're overwhelmed, blah, 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 blah. The leader goes in and says, all right, here's what we're going to do. We're going to delegate this and we're going to do that. We're going to do it. And the leader says, she walked out of the room more confused than when she got in. And that's when it snapped. Oh my God. I didn't need to fix the problem. I just needed to listen. Right? as technologists and people who are engineers and just in this type of a job, we automatically flip to let's solve a problem, let's solve a problem, let's solve a problem. It's not always the case. Some people just want to be listened to. Some people just want to vent. Some people just may want a little direction. That's it.
Yeah, it talks in here about why it's such a struggle, right? And it is partially that problem-solving instinct that a lot of us have. We've talked about other aspects of this, the leader burnout, the stress, the lack of time, which are all true, right? But it does give you some steps to try to get better at this. And these are steps, these are things that I think, we just have to practice and use and understand that not every time there's a problem, you need a solution. Sometimes you just need to help let people vent, and let them know you're there to hear them. And maybe it fixes itself. You don't need it.
Yeah.
You don't need the solution side of this.
Right. And Matt, honestly, this is where some of the other soft skills that we talk about on the show matter, right? Because EQ matters in this type of a situation. Being able to have that emotional intelligence to see what's happening in front of you, because just simple body language. Listening is not multitasking with a laptop while someone's in front of you telling you something's wrong or they need help.
Right.
That sets the wrong tone, right? If you're not actively listening, actively responding, not engaged, you're not going to get the value out of it. So you have to combine it with these other soft skills we talk about all the time. Otherwise, it'll be a fail.
Yeah,
Things like active listening.
Being present,
Yeah.
right? Like really being present in that conversation, the relationship,
Absolutely.
like whatever the relationship is. And I go back to thinking like, you have to know yourself and what type of personality you have. And you have to know the personality and the relationships that you're engaging with, right? And if you don't understand that, you won't understand the difference between somebody asking for help and just asking to be listened to, right? Like there is a difference there, but it's very nuanced. But I think, not only do you have to understand them, but you have to understand yourself and kind of what you're going to gravitate towards. Because like Jason, you said, I do the same thing. Like I like to fix stuff. Like if I get a problem, here's how I'm going to run through it. My wife has a very different communication style, right? Like she'll just need to talk about things. She doesn't necessarily want a solution. Or when she does say stuff, like she hasn't thought through the solution and I've already thought through it, but I have to get her to that point without just getting to the answer. And so it's that dialogue of relationship and understanding how to interact and really how to communicate with a person on the level that they need. And that makes you successful.
That's right.
There were three things in this article that I thought would have helped add to it, or that I thought were a little bit missing. And one was what we're talking about here. As a leader, I think it actually is okay to ask the question. Like Jason and Ben, my husband will sometimes say to me, "Is this the part where I'm supposed to just listen, or is this the part where I'm supposed to problem solve with you?"
Yep.
He'll just ask, right? He just says the question, and I'll be like, "Just let me vent." And he'll be like, okay, fair enough, whatever. Or once we get through that, I'm like, okay, now time to problem solve together. So I think it's okay for a leader to do that. If someone comes into you to ask the question, what do you need right now? How can I be present for you? The next one is there was no mention of remote work. And I think there are nuances to remote work which make some of this being present and body language difficult. Yeah. So I would love to see some discussion around that. Like, how can you be present and show that remotely? And then the third one, and this, I hope this doesn't make me sound insensitive, but I also believe that there is some training that we can do with some of our employees when they come to us to say, I'm glad you trust me with this discussion, and I think it's great, but you may not, you may have a leader in the future who doesn't support this. So here's what I would recommend. Get that venting out with team one before you come to your leader. Now if it's a peer, it's a little bit different, but I do think there's a little bit of training with some of the new generations in the workforce about what you should be venting about and what you shouldn't, especially with your own leadership. And again, I don't mean that in the way of like I have a closed door, but I think it can help them in their careers.
No, I agree. I also think it's the perspective. Again, this is that knowing yourself, knowing who you're communicating to. Like, I think the generational differences in how we communicate. Like you mentioned the remote work, and I tied into the last point too, the digital communication bullet that they had on here, right? I tell people, like, stop emailing me or slacking me. Just pick up the phone and call, like, or get on a Zoom call. Like, let's actually have a conversation about it, because I lose some of the nuance, right? And it's important. Like, I think a lot of people of our generation, like, you don't jump 3 levels of chain to have a conversation. It's like, hey, have you talked to your manager? Have you talked to his manager before you came to me? And I think it's that helping people understand on how you like to be communicated to, like you're saying, Summer, and understanding how they need, and then finding some type of bridge or common ground where you can have that relationship. I love the point you bring up, Summer.
I mean, like everything though, there's balance and there's nuance, because what I'm finding is even if they collaborate with peers or their direct manager, they're still in the same philosophy. And, we have to train our managers to be able to handle that, because they're acting the same way. They're under that same vein of thought, right? And so we have to be training the managers to be able to deal with those situations in the right way.
I talked to someone this week, and we were talking a little about remote work, and I'm a big advocate of it. Matt, I think you are. Jason, you are too.
Yep,
Summer,
absolutely.
sounds like you may be, but you have, But
Yeah.
there's nuance in that too, of like, remote work's awesome, but like, we aren't getting together and people aren't learning by observing, right? Like, we're having conversations or doing something, and somebody isn't just noticing it in the conference room. They're not noticing it in the water cooler conversation. And so we are having to figure out new ways to kind of train less experienced members of the team on some of these softer things that I think we don't realize we got in an office environment, that we just don't get at all now, and we have to figure out a way to do that.
But see, that's where we come in handy, because we've seen it in person, and most likely we're able to pick it up because we're so in tune. Like, I can pick up facial expressions and body movements on a remote meeting in a heartbeat, to the point where I'll drop a call and call someone right away. Right away.
Yeah.
But that's about sharing that. It's about sharing that knowledge with the rest of the team so they can start picking it up as well.
Yeah, but it's assuming the camera's on.
Oh, cameras are mandatory in my culture.
Well,
no emojis. The avatars don't work for you.
No.
Got to be present on camera.
So let me add one in here.
We do that.
Let me add one that I think, other leaders who are listening to, it's food for thought. And I recognized this when so I'm 100% remote, travel a lot for work. Clearly I'm in hotels a lot during this, but I got together for a planning session with all of the leads on my team. And I noticed that, frankly, from working from home, I have become very set in my ways in my context switching, and I have a high. I can context switch easily, and I work at a very fast pace. And then when I'm with people, I realize I need to actually take a step back and realign my expectations and behavior, because it is different being in person, and it is different being in an office. And so I would encourage leaders to actually observe and think about yourself as you're interacting, whether it's on a Zoom, on a phone call, in person, because we've changed in how we operate and how people respond to us. And going back to the article before this one, it's on us to do the good job.
Exactly.
And so I really have to align myself and almost, like, not say meditate, but I've got to get myself ready for being in an office again when I am.
Yeah, it is a change. Yes. As always, thank you so much. It was a great conversation. Thank you, everyone, for watching and listening. We'll see you next week on Business Security Weekly.